The morning sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I locked the front door of the house I'd called home for 43 years. My hands trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion, I couldn't tell anymore. At 68, I found myself doing something I never imagined, driving to hear the reading of my own son's will. I adjusted my tie in the car's side mirror. The charcoal suit I wore had been purchased for my wife Margaret's funeral 8 years ago. Now it would serve for another grim family occasion. How cruelly ironic that a parent should outlive their child. Michael was only 42 when the heart attack took him, the same age I was when he was born. As I slid the key into the ignition of my aging Buick, a voice called out from across the fence. "Hey, Frank, hold up a minute." It was Howard Reynolds, my neighbor of 20-some years, trudging across his meticulously maintained lawn in his bathrobe and slippers, coffee mug in hand. I rolled down the window, forcing myself to be patient though I was already running late. "Morning, Howard. Listen, I hate to bring this up today of all days," he said, leaning down to the window, his breath smelling of coffee and toothpaste. "But I ran into Michael's wife, I mean widow Sarah at the Whole Foods yesterday." I nodded, my jaw tightening at the mention of my daughter-in-law. We'd never been close, even before Michael's death. "Well, she was talking to someone on her phone, didn't see me. She was laughing, Frank. Laughing. And I heard her say something about finally getting what's coming to us, and the old man never needs to know." My fingers gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "Howard, I appreciate you telling me, but I'm already late for—" "That's not all," Howard interrupted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She mentioned the lake house, your lake house. Said something about plans for it. The lake house. My sanctuary. The property I'd purchased with money saved over 30 years of working 60-hour weeks as a contractor. The place where Margaret and I had planned to retire before cancer stole her from me. The home I'd promised Michael he would inherit someday, after I was gone." "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice suddenly hoarse. Howard nodded solemnly. "Just thought you should know before you go in there. Something doesn't smell right about all this." I thanked him, rolled up the window, and backed out of the driveway, my mind reeling. As I navigated the familiar streets of Millfield, Pennsylvania, the town where I'd raised my family and built my construction business from nothing, Howard's words echoed in my head. The digital clock on my dashboard read 9:37 a.m. The reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Goldstein and Morris, the law firm downtown. I had 23 minutes to compose myself, to push down the suspicion now blooming in my chest. I'd given Michael everything, everything a father could give a son. When he wanted to join my construction company instead of going to college, I welcomed him with open arms, taught him everything I knew. When he married Sarah 15 years ago, I helped them with the down payment on their house in the upscale Oakwood neighborhood. When their twins, Emma and Jacob, were born 12 years ago, I set up college funds for both of them. And now this. The old man never needs to know. What exactly was I not supposed to know? The offices of Goldstein and Morris occupied the third floor of one of the few high-rises in our modest downtown. As I rode the elevator up, I straightened my tie again, a nervous habit Margaret used to tease me about. The law firm's reception area was all polished mahogany and leather chairs, designed to convey stability and tradition. "Mr. Harmon, they're waiting for you in the conference room," the receptionist said with the practiced sympathy of someone who regularly dealt with the bereaved. I followed her down a hallway lined with framed law degrees and into a large room dominated by an oval table. And there they were, the people who had constituted my son's inner circle. Sarah sat at the far end, her black dress more fashionable than funereal, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Next to her sat my grandchildren, Emma, solemn and quiet like her father had been at that age, and Jacob, fidgeting with his phone beneath the table. To Sarah's right was her brother, Robert Keller, a financial advisor who had never made me feel comfortable. Something about his too wide smile, and the way his eyes never quite matched it. He'd moved to town 5 years ago and had quickly become Michael's close friend and confidant. Beside him sat Linda Morgan, Michael's longtime assistant at Harmon Construction. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a tissue in her hand. At least someone besides me seemed genuinely affected by my son's passing. And at the head of the table was Morris himself, Jeffrey Morris, the younger partner in the firm, shuffling papers importantly. "Mr. Harmon, please have a seat," Morris said, gesturing to the empty chair across from Sarah. "Now that everyone's here, we can begin." As I lowered myself into the chair, I caught Sarah exchanging a quick glance with her brother. Was it my imagination, or was there something triumphant in that look? "Before we start," Morris continued, "I'd like to express my condolences. Michael was not only a client but a friend." I nodded stiffly, wondering when Morris had become such good friends with my son. Michael had always used the family lawyer, George Patton, who'd handled our affairs for decades. George had drafted my will, Margaret's will, and as far as I knew, Michael's will too. "Where's George Patton?" I asked, interrupting Morris's practiced speech. "He's been our family attorney for 30 years. Morris cleared his throat. "Ah, yes. Mr. Patton drafted the original will, but Michael came to me about 6 months ago to make substantial revisions. As the executor named in the final will, I'll be handling the estate." 6 months ago, around the time Robert had started becoming more involved in Michael's financial affairs. Around the time Michael had begun canceling our weekly lunches with vague excuses about being too busy. "I see," I said, though I didn't see it all. The knot of suspicion in my stomach tightened. "Let's proceed," Morris said, putting on reading glasses and lifting a document. "This is the last will and testament of Michael Frank Harmon, dated January 17th of this year." As Morris read through the legal preamble, I found myself studying Sarah's face. There was something there, a tightness around her mouth, an alertness in her eyes, that reminded me of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "To my beloved wife, Sarah," Morris read, "I leave our family home at 47 Oakwood Drive, all its contents, and the sum of $500,000 from my life insurance policy." Sarah nodded slightly, no surprise registering on her face. "To my children, Emma and Jacob, I leave trust funds of $250,000 each, to be administered by their uncle, Robert Keller, until they reach the age of 25. Robert placed a comforting hand on Jacob's shoulder, a gesture that somehow seemed rehearsed. "To my loyal assistant, Linda Morgan, I leave the sum of $50,000 in appreciation of her years of service." Linda dabbed at her eyes, murmuring, "He didn't have to do that." "And to Harmon Construction," Morris continued, his eyes flicking toward me, "the company my father founded and which we built together, I leave to my wife Sarah and my brother-in-law Robert Keller to manage or dispose of as they see fit." The room seemed to tilt. My company, the business I'd started with nothing but a used truck and a toolbox, that I'd built into one of the most respected construction firms in 3 counties, the legacy I'd planned to pass to my grandchildren someday. Gone. But Morris wasn't finished. Regarding the property known as Pine Lake Retreat, located at 156 Lakeshore Drive, which is currently in my father's name but which he has verbally promised to me as inheritance, I express my wish that upon his death, this property be sold and the proceeds divided equally between my wife and children. My blood ran cold. The lake house wasn't Michael's to bequeath, it was mine. I'd never signed it over to him, though I'd certainly told him it would be his someday. But someday meant after I was gone, not now, not like this. "Excuse me," I interrupted, my voice stronger than I expected. "The lake house is my property. I never legally promised it to Michael. It's not part of his estate." Morris looked uncomfortable. "Yes, Mr. Harmon, that's correct. This portion is simply expressing Michael's wishes, not making a legal transfer. The property remains yours." From across the table, Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "But you did promise it to him, Frank. We all heard you say it would be his." "After I die," I clarified, anger beginning to replace the shock, "which last I checked hasn't happened yet." Robert leaned forward. Frank, we're all emotional today. Michael was just making his wishes clear. No one's trying to take anything from you. The falseness in his tone made my skin crawl. I'd been in enough business negotiations to recognize when I was being played. Continue with the will, I said to Morris, unwilling to create a scene in front of my grandchildren. That concludes the distribution of assets, Morris said, looking relieved. There are some minor bequests to charities that I won't read in detail unless anyone wishes. I'd like a copy of the will, I said. Of course. I've prepared copies for everyone, Morris replied, sliding folders across the table. As the meeting broke up, Sarah approached me, her expression carefully composed into one of sympathy. Frank, I know this is hard. Losing Michael has been devastating for all of us. She placed a manicured hand on my arm. The kids and I would love to have you over for dinner this weekend. We need to stick together as a family now. Family. The word felt hollow coming from her lips. I'll check my calendar, I said noncommittally. As I walked toward the elevator, Linda Morgan hurried to catch up with me. Mr. Harmon, she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to ensure we weren't overheard. Could I talk to you? Not here. It's about Michael. Something in her expression, fear mixed with determination, made me nod. Joe's Diner, 2 blocks down. I'll wait for you there. 20 minutes later, Linda slid into the booth across from me. Joe's was nearly empty at this hour, the lunch rush still an hour away. A waitress brought coffee without being asked. I'd been coming here for decades. I'm sorry about the will, Linda began, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth despite the summer heat outside. It's not right, none of it is. What do you mean? She glanced around nervously before leaning forward. Michael changed in the last year, ever since Robert started working with him on the company finances. They were always in Michael's office with the door closed. And then Sarah started coming to the office too, which she'd never done before. I nodded, encouraging her to continue. 3 months ago, Michael moved all the company financial accounts. New bank, new accountant. He locked me out of the bookkeeping system, said it was streamlining. But I've been handling those books for 15 years. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Did you see anything before you were locked out? Anything unusual? Linda's voice dropped even lower. Large transfers to an LLC I didn't recognize. When I asked Michael about them, he got angry, told me to mind my own business. He'd never spoken to me like that before. What was the LLC called? I asked, my contractor's mind already assembling pieces of a structure I couldn't yet see. Lakeside Ventures, Linda replied. I wrote it down because it seemed strange. I looked it up later. It was registered 6 months ago with Robert Keller as the primary agent. Lakeside, the lake house. Howard's warning about what he'd overheard Sarah saying rushed back to me. There's something else, Linda continued, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded paper. I found this on Michael's desk the day before it happened. I shouldn't have taken it, but it scared me. She pushed the paper across to me. It was a printout of an email from Robert to Michael, dated just 9 days before my son's death. The old man won't sign the transfer papers for the lake property. We need to consider other options before the deadline. The investors won't wait forever, and we're already committed. Call me ASAP. My hands began to shake, but not from age this time, from rage. What transfer papers? I don't know, Linda admitted. But the week before he died, Michael asked me to prepare a folder with all the documentation on the company's current projects. Said he was meeting with potential investors. But Harmon Construction has never had outside investors. It's always been family-owned. Did he say who these investors were? I asked. Linda shook her head. No, but the meeting was at the Westlake Golf Club. Michael wasn't a golfer. The Westlake Golf Club was where the real estate developers congregated. I'd been invited to join years ago but had declined. I preferred fishing to golf, and the membership fees were ridiculous. Thank you, Linda, I said, folding the email and putting it in my pocket. I appreciate your loyalty. Her eyes welled up. Michael was a good man, Mr. Harmon. Whatever was happening, I don't think he fully understood what he was getting into. Robert and Sarah, they can be very persuasive. I paid for the coffee and walked Linda to her car. As I watched her drive away, I felt a cold resolve settling over me. Something was very wrong with my son's death and with the events leading up to it, and I intended to find out exactly what. Instead of going home, I drove to Harmon Construction, the company headquarters I'd built 30 years ago and expanded with Michael's help a decade later. The receptionist looked startled to see me. "Mr. Harmon, we weren't expecting you. Just stopping by," I said casually. "Is Robert in?" "Yes, he arrived about 20 minutes ago. Shall I tell him you're here?" "No need," I said, already walking toward the back offices. "I know the way." I found Robert in Michael's office, my son's name still on the door, sitting behind the desk like he belonged there, talking on the phone. He looked up in surprise as I entered without knocking. "I'll call you back," he said hurriedly into the phone. "Frank, this is unexpected." "It's my company," I replied, "or at least it was until about an hour ago." Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I know the will was a shock, but Michael wanted to secure his family's future. Surely you can understand that." "What I understand," I said, closing the door behind me, "is that something doesn't add up. Michael would never cut me out like this. Not without a reason. People change, Frank. Michael was thinking about the future. The company needs new direction, new investment to stay competitive." "Investment like Lakeside Ventures?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. The flicker of alarm in his eyes was brief but unmistakable. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "I think you are," I said, moving closer to the desk. "I think you and Sarah have been planning something. Something that required my lake property. Something worth manipulating my son for." Robert stood up, his facade of friendliness evaporating. "You should be careful making accusations, Frank. Grief can make people imagine things that aren't there. I'm not imagining the email you sent Michael about the old man not signing the transfer papers, or the investors who won't wait forever." His face hardened. "You're trespassing on private property now, Frank. The will has been read. Harmon Construction belongs to Sarah and me. I suggest you leave before I call security." "Security? In my own company. The company where every employee had called me boss for decades." "This isn't over, Robert," I said, turning to leave. "Not by a long shot." As I walked through the office, I noticed the employees watching me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. These people had been like extended family. Now they looked at me as if I were a stranger. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my car, trying to process everything I'd learned. My son, my only child, had been caught up in something dark, something orchestrated by Sarah and Robert, something that involved my lake property and mysterious investors. And now Michael was dead. The thought I'd been avoiding suddenly crystallized. Had my son's heart attack been entirely natural? He'd been in good health, worked out regularly. The doctors had called it a congenital defect that had gone undetected, a ticking time bomb. But the timing was too convenient. I started the car and headed toward the one person who might be able to help me make sense of this. George Patton, the family lawyer who'd been unceremoniously replaced by Morris. George's office was smaller than Goldstein and Morris, more worn around the edges. He'd been practicing in the same location for almost 40 years, and the Dacre hadn't changed much in that time. His secretary, Betty, who had to be pushing 70 herself, brightened when she saw me. "Frank, how are you holding up? Such a tragedy about Michael." "Is George in?" I asked. "I need to speak with him. It's important." "Let me check," she said, picking up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "Go right in. He's just finishing up some paperwork." George stood as I entered, coming around his desk to grasp my hand firmly. He was a tall man with a shock of white hair that had once been red, his face lined with the wisdom of decades practicing law in a small town. "Frank, I've been meaning to call you. Please sit down." I sank into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. "George, I need your help. Things aren't right with Michael's will." George's expression grew troubled. "I heard." Jeffrey Morris called me this morning professional courtesy. I was surprised, to say the least. The will I drew up for Michael 5 years ago was quite different. Different how? I asked. Well, for one thing, you were the executor, and Harmon Construction was to be held in trust, with you managing it until the grandchildren were old enough to take over if they chose to. The lake house wasn't mentioned at all, since it wasn't Michael's to bequeath. Exactly as I would have expected from my son. George, I think something very wrong is going on. I need to see the original will. I can't give you a copy without proper authorization, George said carefully. But I can tell you its contents, as you were named executor. For the next 20 minutes, George detailed the provisions of Michael's original will. Everything he described aligned with what I knew of my son's wishes and values. Nothing like the document Morris had read today. When exactly did Michael change lawyers? I asked. George consulted a calendar on his desk. He called to retrieve his files on December 3rd of last year. Said he was consolidating his legal affairs with Sarah's attorney. December. Around the time Linda said the company finances started changing. George, have you ever heard of something called Lakeside Ventures? Or any development plans for the Pine Lake area? George removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief, another gesture that hadn't changed in decades. Not specifically, but there have been rumors about a major resort development plan for Pine Lake. The county commissioners have been unusually secretive about the zoning meetings. I leaned forward. What kind of resort? Casino, hotel, luxury condos. The works. They've been trying to get approval for years, but the environmental impact studies have been problematic. Pine Lake is a protected watershed. The pieces were starting to fit together. My lake house sat on 5 acres of prime shoreline. The neighboring properties were similarly sized, mostly owned by families who'd had them for generations. Not the kind of people who would sell to developers. Who's behind the development push? I asked. Officially, a consortium called Northeast Leisure Properties, but word is there's Las Vegas money involved. Big money. Las Vegas. Where Robert had worked before mysteriously deciding to relocate to our small Pennsylvania town 5 years ago. Thanks, George, I said, standing. You've been a big help. Frank, George called as I reached the door. Be careful. If what you're suggesting is true, these aren't people to trifle with. I nodded grimly. Neither am I. My next stop was the county records office. As a contractor, I'd spent countless hours there over the years, researching property lines and zoning regulations. The clerk, Mabel Wilson, had been there almost as long as I'd been building houses. Frank Harmon, as I live and breathe, she said, looking up from her computer. I was so sorry to hear about Michael. He was always such a polite young man. Thank you, Mabel. I need to check some property records around Pine Lake. Any recent sales or transfers? Mabel's expression turned knowing. You've heard the rumors too, then. About the resort. I nodded, and she beckoned me around to her side of the counter, lowering her voice conspiratorially. There's been a buying spree in the last year. 8 properties sold, all to different LLCs, but if you dig deeper, which I did because I'm nosy that way, they all trace back to Northeast Leisure Properties. Could you show me which properties? I asked. Mabel pulled up a map on her computer. The properties formed a horseshoe around the eastern shore of Pine Lake, with my 5 acres sitting right in the middle, the keystone in the arch. They need your land, I murmured, half to myself. Looks that way, Mabel agreed. But you're not selling, are you? That house has been in your family for what, 3 generations? 4, I corrected automatically. My great-grandfather had built the original cabin, though I'd replaced it with a modern home after Margaret and I purchased it from my parents. Can you print me copies of all the sales? I asked. And any information on these LLCs? Mabel glanced around to make sure no one was watching. I shouldn't, but give me 20 minutes. I left the records office with a manila envelope full of documents that confirmed my suspicions. The 8 properties around mine had all sold for well above market value, between 30% and 50% more than they were worth. Someone was desperate to assemble this parcel of land. And if the neighbors had gotten that kind of premium, what would my centrally located 5 acres be worth to them? As I drove home, a plan began to form in my mind. I wasn't a wealthy man by most standards, comfortable, yes, but not rich. The construction company had provided a good living, but I'd always put profits back into the business rather than taking them out. My retirement fund was solid but not extravagant. But if these developers were willing to pay a premium for my land, I pulled into my driveway just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn Howard had helped me mow after Margaret died, and I couldn't seem to find the energy to care about things like grass height. Speaking of Howard, he was waiting on my porch, concern etched across his weathered face. "How'd it go?" he asked as I climbed the steps. "About as well as you'd expect," I replied, unlocking the door and gesturing for him to follow me inside. In the kitchen, I pulled 2 beers from the refrigerator and handed him one. "They're after the lake house," I said without preamble. "There's a casino development planned for Pine Lake. They've bought up all the surrounding properties." Howard whistled low. "Casino? In our county? How'd they get that past the blue laws?" "Money talks. And apparently Robert, Sarah's brother, is connected to the developers. They need my property to complete the parcel." "And Michael was in on this?" Howard asked, his disbelief matching my own from earlier. I took a long pull from my beer before answering. "I don't know. Maybe he was manipulated. Maybe he didn't understand what he was getting into. Or maybe he knew exactly what he was doing," Howard suggested gently. "People change, Frank." I shook my head. "Not Michael, not like this. Something doesn't add up." I spent the next hour showing Howard the documents I'd collected, explaining my theory. With each piece of evidence, my conviction grew stronger. Michael had been caught in something beyond his understanding, manipulated by Sarah and Robert for their own gain. "So what are you going to do?" Howard asked when I finished. "I'm going to find out exactly what happened to my son," I said, "and then I'm going to make sure Sarah and Robert get exactly what they deserve." Howard studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You need any help, you just ask. Margaret would never forgive me if I let you face this alone." After Howard left, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread before me. The clock on the wall, a wedding gift to Margaret and me 45 years ago, ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in the suddenly too quiet house. My phone rang, startling me. The screen showed Sarah's name. "Hello," I answered, striving to keep my voice neutral. "Frank, it's Sarah. I was just checking on you. Today must have been quite a shock." The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but I'd had my eyes opened. "I'm fine, just processing everything. The kids and I would really love to see you this weekend. Sunday dinner, perhaps. We need to talk about the company. There are some opportunities we'd like to discuss with you." "Opportunities?" "Like selling my lake house to complete their development deal." "Sunday sounds fine," I said, seeing an opening to gather more information. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Oh, and Robert will be there too. He has some ideas he thinks you'll find interesting." "I bet he does," I thought grimly. "I'll see you Sunday then," I said. After hanging up, I made another call to Linda Morgan. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Harmon, is everything okay?" "I need a favor, Linda. Access to Michael's computer at the office. His emails, files, anything that might tell me what he was involved in." There was a pause before she answered. "The IT department changed all the passwords after he died. But I have my ways. When do you want to do this?" "Tonight," I said. "Can you meet me at the office in an hour?" The Harmon Construction offices were dark when I pulled into the parking lot at 9:30 p.m. Linda's car was the only one there, parked near the side entrance. She let me in with her key card, looking nervous but determined. "Security doesn't do rounds until midnight," she explained as we made our way through the darkened hallways to Michael's office. "And I disabled the camera on this floor. It'll look like a technical glitch." In Michael's office, Linda sat at his computer and began typing rapidly. They changed his email password but not his cloud storage account. Rookie mistake. Within minutes, she had accessed Michael's digital files. What exactly are we looking for? Anything related to Lakeside Ventures, Northeast Leisure Properties, or the Lake House, I said, standing behind her. Linda opened folder after folder, searching methodically. Most contained routine business documents, contracts, bids, employee records. But then she clicked on a folder labeled simply Personal. Here, she said, pointing to a subfolder called Lake Project. Inside were dozens of documents, surveyor reports, environmental impact studies, property assessments, all focused on Pine Lake, and preliminary architectural drawings for a massive resort complex spanning multiple properties, including mine. They were planning this for over a year, Linda murmured, opening more files. Look at these emails. The correspondence between Robert, Sarah, and someone named Victor Castillo from Northeast Leisure Properties laid out the scheme in black and white. They needed my property to complete their development. Without it, the project wasn't viable. Is there anything about them trying to get me to sign over the property? I asked. Linda searched further, finally opening an email from Sarah to Robert dated 3 months ago. Frank still won't discuss selling. Says he's planning to retire there. Michael needs to work harder on convincing him, or we'll miss our window. Victor says the investors are getting impatient. And Robert's reply, we may need to consider alternate strategies. The old man's stubborn, but everyone has a pressure point. My blood ran cold. Alternate strategies, pressure points. Keep looking, I urged. Anything from right before Michael died. Linda opened more emails, searching backwards chronologically. Then she froze, her hand hovering over the mouse. Mr. Harmon, I don't think you should. Show me, I insisted. She clicked on an email from Michael to Robert, dated the day before he died. I can't do this anymore. I've looked at the environmental reports. This development will destroy Pine Lake. Dad was right to refuse selling. I'm telling him everything tomorrow. This ends now. And Robert's chilling reply, sent just 2 hours later, don't be stupid, Michael. You're in too deep to back out now. Think about what you're risking. We'll discuss this in person. Print everything, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Every email, every document. While Linda gathered the evidence, I stood at the window of my son's office, looking out at the town I'd spent my life building in. My son had planned to betray me, to steal my property for this development scheme. But in the end, he'd found his conscience. And the very next day, he was dead. Coincidence? I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. When Linda finished, I helped her shut down the computer and reset everything exactly as we'd found it. The stack of printed documents felt heavy in my hands, weighted with revelations I was still struggling to process. What will you do now? Linda asked as we slipped out the side entrance. Whatever it takes to get justice for Michael, I replied, and to make sure Sarah and Robert don't profit from any of this. I spent the next 2 days poring over the documents, constructing a timeline of the conspiracy. The picture that emerged was damning. Robert had come to town 5 years ago specifically to lay groundwork for the development. He'd befriended Michael, introduced him to the developers, painted a picture of easy wealth. Sarah had been complicit from the beginning, perhaps even before she married my son. They'd needed my lake property to complete their parcel. When I refused to sell, they'd tried to manipulate Michael into convincing me. When that failed, they'd pressed him to help them find another way. But Michael had finally realized what he was involved in and had threatened to expose them. And then he had died. Suddenly. Conveniently. I couldn't prove they were responsible for Michael's death, but I could make sure they never profited from their scheme. Sunday evening arrived, and I pulled up to Michael and Sarah's house in Oakwood with a plan firmly in mind. The colonial-style home, which I'd helped them buy, was lit up warmly against the gathering dusk. Sarah answered the door, dressed casually but expensively, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Frank, come in. The kids are in the den watching a movie. Robert's in the living room. I followed her inside, carrying a bottle of scotch I'd brought as a prop. In the living room, Robert stood to greet me, his handshake firm, his smile practiced. Frank, good to see you. Glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, matching his false warmth. Sarah mentioned you had some ideas to discuss. Over dinner, Sarah interjected. It's almost ready. Robert, why don't you pour Frank a drink? As Robert busied himself at the bar cart, I took in the living room. Photos of Michael with the children adorned the walls. My son's presence was everywhere, yet somehow absent too. Had this house ever truly been his home, or just another set piece in Sarah and Robert's long con? Scotch, Robert offered, holding out a tumbler. Thanks. I accepted the drink but didn't sip it. So business is good at Harmon Construction. Very good, Robert replied smoothly. In fact, that's part of what we wanted to discuss. There's an opportunity we're exploring that could take the company to the next level. I'm all ears, I said, settling into an armchair. Robert launched into a carefully rehearsed pitch about expansion opportunities, new markets, potential partnerships. Nothing about casinos or lake properties. He was feeling me out, trying to gauge how much I knew. I played along, asking the right questions, feigning interest. All the while, I was watching Sarah as she moved between the living room and kitchen, her expression carefully controlled but her eyes alert, monitoring our conversation. When we moved to the dining room, my grandchildren joined us. Emma, now 12, had Margaret's eyes, observant, intelligent. Jacob was more like Michael had been at that age, quiet, thoughtful, with a quick mind he tried to disguise behind typical preteen nonchalance. Grandpa, are you coming to my science fair next week? Emma asked as we sat down to a roast that I doubted Sarah had cooked herself. Wouldn't miss it, I assured her. What's your project? As Emma enthusiastically described her experiment on water pollution in local lakes, an irony not lost on me, I watched Sarah and Robert exchange glances. They were impatient to steer the conversation back to their agenda. That sounds fascinating, Emma, Robert cut in when she paused for breath. Speaking of the lake, Frank, we wanted to talk to you about the property at Pine Lake. And there it was, the real purpose of this dinner party. Oh, I said, taking a sip of water. What about it? Sarah leaned forward, all business now. Frank, we've had an incredible opportunity come our way. A developer is interested in properties around Pine Lake for a major project. They've made offers to several homeowners in the area. What kind of project? I asked innocently. A resort, Robert said. Very upscale, very environmentally conscious. It would be a tremendous boost to the local economy. And they're interested in my property, I asked, already knowing the answer. They are, Sarah confirmed. They've made a very generous offer, well above market value. We thought, given your age and the fact that you rarely use the lake house anymore, you might be interested. My age. As if 68 made me 1 foot in the grave. How generous is very generous? I asked, cutting into my roast. Robert named a figure that was indeed substantial, about double the property's actual value, but nowhere near what it would be worth to them as the keystone in their development plan. That is generous, I agreed. And you too are involved in this development. How, exactly? A flicker of hesitation crossed Sarah's face. We're not directly, but the company handling the project is a client of Robert's financial firm. He's been advising them on the local market, a convenient half-truth. And how long has this been in the works? I pressed. Just recently, Robert said smoothly. The opportunity came up after. He trailed off, a practiced look of regret crossing his face. After Michael passed. I set down my fork deliberately. That's interesting, because I've been doing some research. The property purchases around Pine Lake have been going on for over a year, and Lakeside Ventures LLC was registered 6 months ago, with you listed as the agent, Robert. The silence around the table was sudden and complete. Even the children sensed the tension, their eyes darting between the adults. Emma, Jacob, Sarah said tightly, why don't you go finish your movie in the den? Once the children had left, Sarah's demeanor changed completely. The pretense of familial warmth vanished, replaced by cold calculation. What exactly are you implying, Frank? She asked. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You and Robert have been planning this development for years. You've been buying up properties around mine, and you need my land to make it work." Robert's smile became brittle. "Business is business, Frank. Yes, we've been assembling parcels for the development. And yes, yours is a key piece. That's why we're offering you such a generous price. And that's why Michael changed his will, to make sure you two controlled everything after he was gone," I asked, my voice hardening. "Michael understood the opportunity," Sarah said dismissively. "He was thinking of the family's future." "Was he?" I countered. "Because I have an email he sent the day before he died saying he couldn't go through with it, that he was going to tell me everything." The color drained from Sarah's face. Robert's expression hardened into something dangerous. "You're bluffing," he said. "There's no email." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded paper, a copy of Michael's final email to Robert. I placed it on the table between us. "Am I?" Sarah snatched up the paper, her eyes scanning the text. When she looked up, her expression had changed from disbelief to calculation. "This proves nothing," she said. "Michael was under a lot of stress. He wasn't thinking clearly." "He was thinking clearly enough to realize what you two were doing," I replied. "Using him to get to my property. Manipulating him into betraying his own father." "Nobody manipulated Michael," Robert snapped. "He was a grown man who made his own decisions." "Until his final decision," I said quietly. "The one where he chose his conscience over your schemes. The one he made right before his convenient heart attack." Sarah stood up abruptly. "I think you should leave, Frank. You're upset you're making wild accusations." "I'm not going anywhere," I interrupted, remaining seated. "Not until we finish this conversation. Not until we talk about Northeast Leisure Properties and Victor Castillo and the environmental reports that Michael found, the ones that showed this development would destroy Pine Lake." Robert's face had gone rigid. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I have every idea," I countered. "I have copies of all the documents, all the emails. I know exactly what you were planning. And I know Michael threatened to expose you." "And what do you think happened?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "Do you think we—" "What? Killed your son, your precious Michael who could do no wrong?" The naked contempt in her voice shocked me. This was the real Sarah, finally revealed. A woman who had never loved my son, who had seen him only as a means to an end. "I think Michael realized too late what kind of people he'd gotten involved with," I said. "And I think his death was very convenient for your plans." Robert stood now too, looming over me. "You should be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, Frank. Very careful indeed." I rose to face him, refusing to be intimidated in my own son's house. "I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. And here's another fact. I will never sell you my lake property. Not for any price." "You're making a mistake," Robert said, his voice low and threatening. "No, you made the mistake," I replied. "You thought I was just a sentimental old man who could be manipulated or bullied. You thought wrong." I turned to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped me. "What do you want, Frank? Money? A bigger offer for the lake house? Just name your price." I turned back slowly. "What I want is justice for my son. And I'm going to get it, one way or another." Outside, I sat in my car for several minutes, letting my racing heart settle. I'd revealed my hand, perhaps too soon, perhaps too completely. But I'd needed to see their reactions, to confirm my suspicions. And what I'd seen had convinced me. Sarah and Robert were capable of anything, including arranging my son's death to protect their scheme. Now I needed to protect myself, and to make sure they paid for what they'd done. The next morning I made 3 stops. First, to my bank, where I withdrew a significant amount of cash and placed several documents in a safe deposit box. Second, to a security company, where I arranged for cameras to be installed at both my home and the lake house. And third, to the office of District Attorney Caroline Wu. Caroline had been a friend of Margaret's, though considerably younger. She'd run for DA on an anti-corruption platform and had won handily against the Old Boy network that had controlled county politics for decades. "Frank," she greeted me warmly, rising from behind her desk. "It's been too long. I was so sorry about Michael." Thank you, Caroline. That's actually why I'm here. For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered, the development scheme, the manipulation of Michael, his final email, and his subsequent death. I gave her copies of all the documents Linda and I had found. Caroline listened intently, taking notes, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. This is concerning, she said when I finished. The development scheme itself might not be illegal, unethical, and environmentally destructive, yes, but potentially legal if they've greased the right palms. But if what you're suggesting about Michael's death is true, I don't have proof, I admitted. Just timing and motive. Sometimes that's enough to start an investigation, Caroline said thoughtfully. I'll have my office look into this, Frank, quietly for now. We'll check Michael's medical records, interview the first responders, see if anything unusual was overlooked. Thank you, I said, relieved to have an ally. In the meantime, I'm concerned about my own safety. If they were willing to harm Michael, Caroline's expression hardened. I'll have a patrol car drive by your house regularly. And Frank, be careful. Don't confront them again without witnesses present. I won't, I promised, though I already knew my plan would require me to do exactly that. Over the next 2 weeks, I put my strategy into motion. First, I visited George Patton again and updated my will, making specific provisions that would ensure my wishes were carried out no matter what happened to me. Next, I hired a private investigator named Ray Alvarez, a former state police detective who now specialized in corporate malfeasance. His task was simple: dig deeper into Robert's background, his connections to Northeast Leisure Properties, and anything he could find about Victor Castillo. While Ray worked, I made a show of reconsidering Sarah and Robert's offer for the lake house. I called Sarah, telling her I'd been thinking things over and might be open to negotiation after all. Her eagerness to rebuild bridges was telling and convenient for my purposes. That's wonderful news, Frank, she gushed. Why don't we meet at the lake house this weekend? You can name your price and we can put this unpleasantness behind us. Sunday afternoon, I agreed, just the three of us. By Sunday, Ray had delivered his preliminary findings, which exceeded my expectations. Robert Keller had worked for a Las Vegas investment firm with known ties to organized crime. He'd left Nevada under a cloud, just ahead of a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation. And Victor Castillo had been implicated in 2 previous development schemes that had collapsed amid allegations of fraud and environmental violations. Armed with this information, and with cameras now installed at strategic locations around the lake house, I was ready for my final confrontation with Sarah and Robert. The lake house stood on a wooded peninsula jutting into Pine Lake, its glass and cedar construction blending harmoniously with the natural surroundings. My great-grandfather had chosen the site well, and each generation of my family had treasured it, until now. I arrived early on Sunday, making sure the security cameras were functioning properly and positioning my phone to record audio. Then I waited on the deck overlooking the water, a place where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset, where Michael had learned to fish, where I'd planned to spend my remaining years in peace. Sarah and Robert arrived together in his Mercedes, both dressed casually but expensively. Their confident smiles suggested they believed they had won. "Frank," Sarah called, waving as they approached the deck. "The place looks wonderful. You've kept it up beautifully." "I try," I said, rising to greet them. "Can I offer you a drink? I've made iced tea." "That would be lovely," Sarah replied, settling into one of the deck chairs. Robert remained standing, surveying the property with the calculating eye of a developer already planning where to bulldoze. "Prime location," he remarked. "You can see why it's so valuable to the project." "I can imagine," I agreed, handing them each a glass of tea. "So tell me more about this development. The full story this time." Robert and Sarah exchanged glances before Robert launched into his pitch: a luxury resort with gambling, shopping, condominiums, a marina. The eco-friendly aspects he emphasized seemed like afterthoughts, greenwashing to make the massive development more palatable. And the environmental impact? I asked. Michael seemed concerned about that according to his final email. Sarah waved dismissively. Michael was being dramatic. The environmental studies show minimal impact. Not the studies I saw, I countered. The ones that predicted significant damage to the watershed, potential contamination of the lake, destruction of habitats for several endangered species. There are always multiple studies with different findings, Robert said smoothly. It depends on the methodology. And who's paying for the study, I added. Robert's smile tightened. Look, Frank, we're not here to debate environmental science. We're here to make a deal. You want to sell, we want to buy. Let's talk numbers. I'm curious about something first, I said, leaning forward. How exactly did Michael die? The question hung in the air between us. Sarah's face drained of color. Robert's expression hardened. He had a heart attack, Sarah said stiffly. You know that. A perfectly healthy 42-year-old man with no history of heart problems, I pressed. The day after he emailed Robert saying he was going to expose your scheme. That's a dangerous accusation, Frank, Robert said, his voice low and threatening. It's a question, I corrected. One that the district attorney is also asking. She's reopening the investigation into Michael's death. That got their attention. Sarah's hand tightened around her glass. Robert's confident demeanor slipped. There's nothing to investigate, Sarah insisted. It was natural causes. The medical examiner confirmed it. Medical examiners can miss things, I said, especially if they're not looking for them, but Caroline Wu is looking now. Very carefully. Robert set down his glass with deliberate control. What exactly are you implying, Frank? I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that your scheme is over. The DA has copies of all the documents, all the emails. She knows about the development plan, about how you manipulated Michael, about his threat to expose you. Those emails prove nothing illegal, Robert countered, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Maybe not by themselves, I agreed. But combined with Ray Alvarez's investigation into your background, Robert, your hasty departure from Las Vegas, your connections to certain investors, Victor Castillo's history of fraud, it paints a compelling picture. Robert stood abruptly. This conversation is over. We came here in good faith to make a business deal. Instead, you're making wild accusations and threats. Not threats, I said calmly, just facts. And here's another fact. I'm never selling this property to you or your developers. Not now, not ever. You'll regret this, Sarah hissed, her mask of civility completely gone now. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I think I do, I replied. And so does the DA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Gaming Commission, and the FBI, who are quite interested in some of your investors' backgrounds. Robert grabbed Sarah's arm. We're leaving. This old man is bluffing. As they turned to go, I called after them. One more thing. I've updated my will. If anything happens to me, anything at all, this property goes directly into a conservation trust. It can never be developed, never be sold. And all my evidence goes public, just so we're clear. Their retreating backs told me all I needed to know about their reactions. After they left, I sat on the deck for a long time, watching the sun set over Pine Lake. The security cameras had captured everything, and my phone had recorded the entire conversation. More evidence for Caroline Wu's investigation. But the real victory was in knowing I'd disrupted their plans completely. Without my property, their development couldn't proceed. The investors would pull out, the money would dry up, and Sarah and Robert would be left with nothing but broken promises and potential criminal charges. It wasn't justice for Michael, not yet, but it was a start. 2 months later, I sat in Caroline Wu's office, listening as she updated me on her investigation. The medical examiner has revised his findings, she said, sliding a report across her desk. After reviewing Michael's tissue samples more thoroughly, he found traces of a substance that can induce cardiac symptoms identical to a heart attack. It's not conclusive proof of murder, but it's enough for me to open a formal homicide investigation. And Sarah and Robert? I asked. We executed search warrants on their homes and offices yesterday. Found quite a lot of interesting material, including communications with Victor Castillo that suggest they were aware of the environmental report Michael discovered, the one that would have killed their development if it became public. A weight I'd carried since Michael's death began to lift. So you think you can prove they were responsible? We're building the case, Caroline said carefully. These things take time, but yes, I believe we'll get there. In the meantime, the Gaming Commission has suspended Northeast Leisure's application pending the outcome of our investigation. The development is effectively dead. As I drove home from Caroline's office, I took a detour to the cemetery where Michael and Margaret were both buried. The autumn leaves were turning, creating a tapestry of red and gold around the granite headstones. I stood between their graves, feeling their presence in the cool October air. We're getting there, I told Michael softly. They won't get away with what they did to you, and they won't destroy the lake you loved. A sense of peace settled over me as I made my way back to my car. The road to justice was long, and I knew there would be more battles ahead. Sarah and Robert had resources, connections. They wouldn't go down without a fight. But I had something stronger than money or connections. I had the truth. And I had a promise to keep, to my son, to my wife, and to myself. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the lake house, watching as U.S. Marshals led Robert Keller and Victor Castillo away in handcuffs. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, environmental violations, and, most significantly, the murder of my son. Sarah had turned state's evidence, cutting a deal to testify against her brother and Castillo in exchange for immunity on the murder charge. She still faced significant time for her role in the fraud, but she'd escaped the most serious consequences. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. The lake property remained mine and would one day pass to Emma and Jacob, Michael's children, who were innocent in all of this. I'd set up a trust to ensure it would always remain in the family, protected from development and preserved for future generations. As the police cars disappeared down the winding road, Linda Morgan joined me on the deck, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. Michael would be proud, she said, of everything you did to get justice for him. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I just wish he'd trusted me enough to come to me sooner, before it was too late. He was trying to protect you, Linda suggested. That's what sons do for their fathers, even when it's misguided. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps Michael had been trying, in his own way, to shield me from the ugliness he'd become entangled in. In his final act, he'd chosen to do the right thing, to expose the truth regardless of the consequences. In that, he'd proven himself to be my son after all. The sun was setting over Pine Lake, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere nearby, a loon called, that haunting, mournful sound that had been the soundtrack to so many family memories. I think I'll stay here tonight, I told Linda. It feels right. After she left, I sat alone on the deck, watching darkness settle over the lake. The developers were gone, their plans thwarted. My son's killers would face justice. The lake would remain unspoiled for generations to come. It wasn't the retirement Margaret and I had planned all those years ago. It wasn't the future I'd imagined when Michael was growing up, when I'd taught him to fish from this very dock, when I dreamed of grandchildren following in our footsteps. But it was something, a kind of peace, a kind of justice. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast, to Margaret, to Michael, to the truth that had finally come to light. We did it, I whispered to the night. We did it. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.